thank you for welcoming me to the Library Company of Philadelphia to be able to participate in the work that we do collectively here in Philadelphia. Believe it or not, although I went to college here and although my book is largely focused on Philadelphia and draws heavily upon the archives across the city, from the urban archives in Temple, Swarthmore College, Library Company of Philadelphia, the Balch Institute of Ethnic Studies, which I believe no longer is an archive, Historical Society. I pretty much combed anywhere that I could find the history that I will share some of it with you, partly because it was truly looking for a needle in a haystack. So I have very deep affinities to Philadelphia. I have family here. I have family in the audience. Wait here. My stepmother, my stepbrother's here, aunt and cousin, and there are many other family in West Philadelphia. So this is very much home. But I've not had a chance to talk much about my work here. And so I wanted to do something a little different tonight with regard to my actual research. I wanted to focus on a more visual sense of the actual archives. It's not as much visual as I'd like it to be. With more time and less demands administratively, I could have done some things more interestingly. But you'll get a different take on a story that I've told elsewhere. I also want to congratulate Richard Newman for this new journey that you are about to embark on. It comes with many rewards and many challenges. So when you're ready to discuss either, at my card, talk to Phil Lepsansky, who is a pioneer in the world of history. I think we've got another outage here. Thank you for your tireless work. I want to say a few things about the Schomburg Center. I am not going to compete with the claim here, although I will verify it with my archivist when we get back. So you may have fired the first shot across the bow. That's absolutely true, of course, that the Schomburg Center has focused largely on the 20th century, in part because it has been a place of living history making. And one of the things that I think is fascinating to talk about in relationship to the larger world of African diasporic collecting as well as African American collecting is that it really is in the service of constant, not just revision, but also social transformation. And one of the things that's very clear, having only been at the Schomburg Center now for just shy of 3 years, is just walking in the space. And that space is not just the several walls that make up the 75,000 square foot complex, but the actual intersection of 135th Street and Lenox Avenue, also known as Malcolm X Boulevard, is truly the birthplace of the Black Renaissance. And not just known as the Harlem Renaissance, but also the place where early migrants who bypassed Philadelphia, for example, although some came from Philadelphia, that's where they first moved to northern Manhattan. So there was the Lower East Side, the Lower West Side, known as Little San Juan. But for those new migrants coming from the South in the period that just precedes the Great Migration period, it's not 125th Street that is the place of settlement. It's 135th Street. It's a place where a black realtor named Peyton is able to essentially open up housing, a series of brownstones on 135th Street, extending from Lenox Avenue west to what is now known as Adam Clayton Boulevard. It is also the home of the YMCA. And of course, Philadelphia has its own storied history of the colored YMCA. This is the place where Jacob Lawrence is taught by Augusta Savage Black history in a history club. This is the place where the very first real attempt to establish a visual arts community that is connected to the federal government's WPA project begins in a library, which is not the Schomburg Center Library, but in fact is the 135th Street branch of the library, a place that opens in 1904, serving largely a German immigrant population. And as the clients and readers and patrons and users of that library changed over time, they came with the patois of Jamaica They came with the Creole language of New Orleans. They came from South Carolina. They began to make certain demands on the librarians, as any librarian here knows. And that's what started the process of the Renaissance of learning that took place there. And I think that is a very powerful story because that Renaissance continues. Not just in the learning and the empowerment and the engagement, but also the way in which the past constantly interacts with the present. So the Schamburg is both a repository. It is both the place that is the central location for telling the story of the Harlem Renaissance. Although and this is a story yet to be told, Beinecke Library, due to Carl Van Vechten's relationship to many Harlem Renaissance figures, from James Weldon Johnson to County Cullen and others, has a lot of Harlem Renaissance writers. And if I had my druthers, I'd figure out a way to wrestle all that material back to Harlem. But short of the Beinecke collection at Yale University, the Schomburg Center has the epicenter of what makes up that early Renaissance moment. A few other highlights that I think are important to think about the relationship between repositories and history making. Because it's not just what we do as historians. It's not just the way in which we see things differently through our contemporary lenses, even though some of us like to hide behind the kind of veneer of objectivity. All of us are influenced by our own journeys, and therefore the very questions that we ask of the archives are grounded in both our experience and our way of seeing the world. And so those questions constantly change, are constantly revised. So the very questions that Langston Hughes brought to the archives of Arturo Alfonso Schomburg, an Afro-Puerto Rican bibliophile, whose collection became the Schomburg collection in 1925. The questions that Langston Hughes asked of that from the 1920s changed in the 1940s, 50s, up until his death in 1967. The very kinds of self-discovery and questions about race and the hypocrisies of the meta-narratives of American progress that James Baldwin searched for in the pages of the books of the Schomburg collection, where he famously said he read every single book of that library in the 1940s, were different for him than they were on the eve of his death in the 1980s. Harry Belafonte, for example, tells a famous story of returning from World War II as a young GI, not making a whole lot of money, wanting to make a go of his life in the United States. He was doing some janitorial work for a neighbor in West Harlem. Instead of paying him, to which he said he was much disappointed, he received 2 theater tickets. 2 theater tickets to what is now the American Negro. Well, what was then the American Negro Theater, established in 1942 by Abram Harris and Fred O'Neill. Some of you may know the movie Anna LaCasta, or the Broadway play upon which it was based, which starred Sammy Davis and Eartha Kitt. Well, that play, then later movie, was incubated in the American Negro Theater, whose home was the basement of the 135th Street Library. Ruby Dee was also a part of that. Sidney Poitier and Harry Belafonte met there. So think about his role in history and the relationship of his role in history as not just someone who was a close confidant and a supporter of Dr. Martin Luther King, but someone who went on to take on the struggle against apartheid, who went on to really give the imprimatur of his artist-activist career to hip-hop, producing one of the first movies on hip-hop called Beat Street, and now continues to fight against the ravages of mass incarceration. It was because of the history that was around him in that library that was the focus of the American Negro Theater. It was Paul Robeson who came by the theater who used to say to those young aspiring thespians that they were on the right path, that through the arts, through theater, you could change people's way of seeing the world. You could touch people in ways that spoke to them differently than, say, reading a book or hearing a lecture. And I'll just say lastly about the relationship of archives to history making, something I only learned recently, and fortunately it's like I'm in, what is the place that Willy Wonka owns? What is it? It's just called the Chocolate Factory. So people used to ask me when I first started at Schomburg, what is it like to work at the Schomburg? What do you like? I said, well, it's like being a kid in a toy store. You're surrounded by toys, or being a kid trapped in a candy store. except you eat too much candy, you get a little sick of it. You are literally overwhelmed with the new knowledge that is gained. So I only learned recently by reading an essay written by Jean Blackwell Hudson. Some of you may know her. She was the curator for 32 years. She took over from Dr. Lawrence Reddick in 1948. He was also at Temple University president. These lines and intersections. By the way, even Dr. Lawrence Reddick left the Schamburg, moved to Atlanta eventually, became best friends with the Kings, and was the only person to travel with Dr. King to to India with Coretta in 1956. He was also on the board of SCLC. But to this story that I learned recently by reading an essay by Jean Blackwell Hudson, who succeeded Lawrence Reddick from 48 to 1980, she said that in being a resource to so many different travelers in Harlem over those years, that original research was done at the Schomburg Center by Kenneth Clark and Mamie Clark, who were Harlem residents, that went into the Brown versus Board of Education case. And so if you think about now celebrating the 60th year, looking back from this moment to that moment, and although there are many challenges and in some cases regrets about the singular focus on desegregation, there's no question that Brown versus Board of Education was the beginning of the end of legal segregation in this country, and that an archive, so this is not just Schomburg boosterism, but that an archive could play such a critical role in providing material evidence of the voice and the experience of people that for so long had been denied their agency, or at least that their agency might be muted in the most impactful decision-making ways. That's an important responsibility that archives carry with them. And the challenge for us is to tell that story, to be proud of what we are capable of, to invest and, as we say, or as I used to say in Atlantic City when I was a college student traveling there on the weekends, double down. We need to double down on what we do, because in an age, in an information age, for example, something I learned from Carter G. Woodson in Miseducation of the Negro, he was deeply concerned about the kind and quality of education that African Americans were receiving in his time. The book was published in 1933, and many of you know who Carter G. Woodson was. For those who don't, he was a Harvard-trained Ph.D. in history. He was the founder of the first African American Negro academic. Well, even that's a little bit distinctive. Archibald Schomburg established the Negro Historical Research Society. There's a Philadelphia Historical Research Society, which did include academics. But let's just say, for argument's sake, that it is the first academic professional society known as the Association for the Study of Life and African American History. Any Asala folks in the room? Okay. Yes. So Carter G. Woodson goes on to found the Journal of Negro History. But what he says in the Miseducation of the Negro, he says that we must make a distinction between information and education. Information and education. This is nearly 80 years before the quote-unquote information age. Because even in that moment, the speed of that era, whether it came through the airwaves of radio, whether it came through the ability to use, well, the telegram was pretty old by then. And I took, a history of science and technology is kind of a sub-interest of mine. So I can't remember the latest speedy technology in that moment. Suffice it to say, for him, the idea that people who knew things but did not understand them was deeply problematic to taking on the challenge and the crisis of Jim Crow in that moment. And I think that that pearl of wisdom from 1933 holds true for us today. It's easy for us all to keyword search, even digitized archives. And I can tell you, if I had had the ability to keyword search the Philadelphia Tribune, which I read for 4 decades of, from 1900 to 1940, I would not know half the history of this great city and its African American population, because I would have simply cut through all of the context, the detail, and the nuance to look for that singular quote, or that singular entry. I had to read everything in search of those needles in those haystacks. So that's the downside, and that's if we as archivists and those of us who know the value of the text and the context in which the text is written don't stand up for what we do not promote what we do, we'll lose ground to those keyword searches. We'll lose ground. So this is not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but it is to suggest that in an age of Google, it will appear that we are truly antiquarian. That we will look like, why did we invest so many resources in the material culture of the past when we can just extract the text? These are talking points, to be frank, I have to admit, I had to learn. Because I did not fully appreciate what this meant until I became the director of the Schomburg. But rest assured that in that capacity, I appreciate it, I understand it, I see the impact every day, and I hear the stories of the wonderful things that have happened as a result. So to Dr. Newman, you know the history, use it wisely. Make sure that you understand, not that you understand, that you help others to understand that what we do in places like this is not just about telling you stories, but also telling you stories that meet the challenges of our time. And sometimes those dots are not always straight, and they don't have to be. But if we don't make the effort, if we do not make the effort, how many read, for example, the report by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences called The Heart of the Matter? Well, if you haven't read it, well, Richard read it as well, he should have. If you've not read it, and you're interested in at least understanding the tone and the sense of urgency that I'm trying to communicate, you can download it. It's called The Heart of the Matter by the Academy of Arts and Sciences. And it calls for explicitly, for these three reasons, it calls for a robust engagement in the work of public intellectualism. Because if those who have knowledge and who are committed to scholarship do not fight for what they do, the humanities will continue to lose ground. The humanities, even by NEH's funding, have lost 50% of their funding over the last 10 years. And for them, the crisis affects the quality of public education in this country, number one, the quality of teacher training in this country. Our teachers cannot teach what they do not know. And then lastly, which is a kind of catch-all, problematic in my book, but nevertheless it tends to motivate people, national security. So for those three reasons, they say, we must fight for the humanities, we must make the connection between what we do and what our publics think we do much clearer and much more direct. So I want to spend the next 25, 30 minutes, I've spoken now for 15 minutes, I'll go for 45, sharing some of the fascinating things I learned in a journey to understand what was the history of ideas about black people coming to places like Philadelphia during the Great Migration period, so this lies just beyond the scope of the library company, that was distinctive or different from the understanding of black people in the South when it came to crime. So the usual story, the one that most of us know, and I'll explain a little bit about why that's an important question. So the story that many of you know is that as a result of the emancipation period, overnight a series of laws are passed known commonly as the Black Codes across every formerly Confederate state. And I'm sure there are books here in the library written in the contemporary period to describe both why they were necessary and why they were abominable. But these codes essentially took every measure of freedom that was granted by dint of emancipation and drew very sharp lines around African Americans saying if you cross this line, you would be subject to prosecution. So what does that mean practically speaking? Well, if you signed a contract to work on a white plantation owner's land as a free person, as a freedman or freedwoman, and you decided that the terms of the contract were unacceptable, you would not be prosecuted. We would not go to civil court. you would be prosecuted in criminal court if you walked away from the job. If, in fact, you were being exploited or cheated, if you claimed that you had harvested said number of bales of cotton and the plantation owner said there were far fewer and you challenged him and walked away from that, you would be subject to a vagrancy violation and could, in fact, be sold to the highest bidder, which could be either the person who you just had a disagreement with or a former slave owner on another plantation. It was truly a draconian set of laws to fundamentally limit the meaning of freedom. And we all know that the most common expressions of black freedom was the reuniting of families, the building of black institutions, schools, and churches, and the pursuit of literacy and education. And on all of those fronts posed a fundamental challenge to the creation of what really became a set of dominant ideas about black inferiority. They precede this moment, but they take on new urgency after slavery. In fact, because there's so many 19th century bibliophiles here, you well know that the abolitionist movement produces a set of pro-slavery ideas and arguments that rely increasingly on racial science to justify slavery first. And so those laws included a history of Africa as a history of savagery where there was in fact no historical change. As George Hegel once said, that Africa was stuck in a state of nature. You had to be civilized to actually have historicity, to see change over time. That's just one idea in terms of how we understand the past. Others had to do with the constitution of black people, that is, their physical makeup, by measuring the size of their brains, the shape of their face, the angle of their nose, the color of their skin, the texture of their hair, the smell of their body. Even Thomas Jefferson famously wrote in Notes on the State of Virginia that black people had a distinctive body odor, as he himself wrestled with the rationalization, finding evidence in biology for the justification for slavery, one of America's greatest contradictions. And so that landscape of ideas was not, in fact, resolved by the war. Yes, the Union won the war, but it did not necessarily win the war of ideas. And so when I look to the period after the Civil War, when I wanted to understand more than just the story of the invention of convict leasing, which was the mechanism to ensnare all of those recently freed African Americans who challenged white authority, who were designated too uppity, or who insisted upon voting as Republicans in the South. And we know even in the city of Philadelphia in the late 19th century there was a purging of black Republicans. Well, when I wanted to understand what did it look like in the urban North in the same time period? What did it look like for what James Grossman, the former Newberry curator and archivist and now head of the American Historical Association, wrote a book called Land of Hope. And Richard, help me out. Land of Hope and something. Called them vanguard migrants. Called them the migrants of the talented 10th. These were the first migrants to leave the South. Some were exodusters who moved to the West, to places like Kansas and Oklahoma. But those who moved north to what will become the industrial centers of the Second Industrial Revolution, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Philadelphia, New York, so on and so forth. What was the experience of those vanguard migrants at the moment of a national reconciliation on the question of second-class citizenship, on the question of resolving the race question? And you know this also through the moment of redemption, the great compromise of 1877, where in a presidential race, not unlike the one in 2000, Gore versus Bush, is decided in the Supreme Court. It's actually decided in the House of Representatives. It didn't quite get to the Supreme Court. But Samuel Tilden and Rutherford B. Hayes strike a compromise, essentially leaves the South to the South and African Americans to second-class citizenship and makes possible Jim Crow. Okay, I've given you everything you already know because I want to emphasize, I want to drill down to a moment that we haven't paid much attention to. And here's the big argument. That today we live in a moment, so here's the contemporary lens. We live in a moment where the question of African-American criminality cuts to the heart of the persistence and the endurance of racial inequality in this nation. The two issues of the quality of education and the problem of crime and incarceration represent two of the most debated and discussed issues about where are we now from 150 years since the emancipation period to say 50 years since the civil rights movement. And so the question that I wanted to ask is, does something about Philadelphia's history in the 1890s teach us something about today that is more salient than what we've learned, what we all know about what was happening when Jim Crow was invented in the South? Now, I didn't come up with this question entirely on my own. In fact, it's been part of a renaissance of interest in understanding the history of racial inequality outside of the South. Tom Segru at the University of Pennsylvania wrote a book about Detroit called The Origins of the Urban Crisis, which has been a transformative work of looking at the history of deindustrialization in that great modern metropolis, alongside white flight and the role that both liberals and federal officials played in extending privileges to white homeowners denied to blacks, including homeowners and renters. Tom's at the University of Pennsylvania. He served as an outside reader on my dissertation. I'm only acknowledging him because we're in Philadelphia. Some of you may know his work, but also to say that it was partly his interest in the North that helped to inspire my own interest in understanding an earlier history of the North. Now, many of you who know the bibliography, maybe not here at the Library Company, since it's a 20th century scholarship, knows, who's ever read Gilbert Ossowski's Harlem in the Making of a Ghetto? Yes. Again, another paradigmatic text published in 1969, looking at the progressive era North. But it is deeply, deeply problematic in the way in which it looks at primary source material and takes as a given the contemporary voice of the social scientific community in essentially muting or misreading the agency and the voice of African Americans. And this is controversial. So I say this to acknowledge that my claims are interpretive claims. People can reasonably disagree, just as they reasonably disagree as to whether Moynihan was a genius or a racist. But those are the stakes. Those are the stakes of the analysis that I try to understand looking back at that progressive era that Gilbert Ossowski engaged, and wondering whether we might learn something about our contemporary reality today by studying it. I'll mention one other work which was incredibly influential to me, perhaps not for good reasons, Roger Lane's work, The Roots of Violence in Black Philadelphia, covering the period 1860 to 1900. Roger Lane spent many years at Haverford College. He was widely respected as a leading authority on African American history. He wrote a book about a famous bibliophile and collector, William Dorsey, based on a scrapbook, which I did look at not Cheney, but Lincoln University, yes, on microfilm. Well, Roger Lane made a series of claims, not unlike my own, where he said that the origins of the crisis of criminality in the 1980s, more popularly known as the crack era, that gave birth to the war on drugs, could be found, roots of violence, in Black Philadelphia. So you see, I'm also not the first person to come to this period with that question. It was truly Roger Lane's work that was sort of, anyone who's been a graduate student and expected to write a dissertation, you need a target to put on a wall to throw darts at. And that's what his work was to me. So he's passed on, right, Roger Lane? Well, you see, we're not buddies. I'm not meaning to be disrespectful. I thought he passed on, but we can look that up. Someone can Google that before we get out of here to see if Roger Lane is still with us. So out of the most respect, one day someone will put my book up on a wall and throw darts at it. I mean that in the most respectful way. that this is a revision of the arguments that Roger Lane set out to do, and it begins in the 1890s. So let me start with the first slide. We're going to move through these fairly quickly because I want them to be illustrative. I've laid out a lot of arguments. But if we think about our contemporary moment, where all of us can agree that there's a black crime problem. Now, we could debate whether it's structural, whether it's cultural. In fact, that's precisely what the debate is. But I don't want to waste any time us kidding ourselves that even in Philadelphia, where certainly I'm in New York, I read the news, there's tremendous anxiety about what to do about crime among African Americans right now, today. Now, for most people, a conversation about African American criminality starts and often ends with statistics, because we consider those statistics evidence that is unimpeachable, indisputable, facts. And so because we want to claim a certain level of expertise, even as lay speakers, as citizens, as people engaged in the public sphere, we want to lay claim to the facts. Any one of us can look at the latest arrest statistics in Philadelphia, or we can look at incarceration rates, and we can say black people have a disproportionate rate of criminal offending in this city and across the nation. Well, what I want to say to you to start with, which is not a question that Roger Lane asked because he used those statistics in that period uncritically, is to say, why is the question itself even relevant? Because as it turns out, we don't know today how many Italian Americans commit crime in Philadelphia, or Irish Americans, or Polish Catholics, or German immigrants. But the truth is, we used to. We actually used to know. And if the Library Company actually has late 19th century police annual reports, I know they have them at the Urban Archives and they have them at Penn and Van Pelt Library. If you pull out an annual report, kind of like an Excel spreadsheet today, you open it up and you see the budget and the number of police cars that were purchased in a year, depending on what year it is, so that's in the 1920s. But a complete itemization of the expenses of the police department, but also a complete record of arrests. And usually it would look something like this. It'd be a folded page, and it would open up like a spreadsheet. And of course, if you're looking at it, it's 100 years old. You know, every time you turn it, something's falling apart. I wasn't as sensitive to these sorts of things than I am now. But across the top heading, it would say Lithuanian, Scandinavian, Irish, Italian, German. I mean, all the way, Mexican. And usually either on the left or the white, Negro, up. But at some point, that went away. At some point, it just became white, Negro, other. And why is that? How did that happen? Because I would submit that the very way in which we know black people are criminals, the very way in which we make it a problem, is because we have a gaze. We have been surveying the black community for far longer than any other communities. In fact, one of the major questions that my work asks is, how did we go from criminality as something plural, multiple ethnicities and nationalities, to something singular? Because although we still look at white and black, and there are a few other categories, even to this day, the white category is not meant to be the subject of surveillance and scrutiny. It is the baseline on which we measure deviance for African American or black. So everything that we talk about in our contemporary society is only predicated on the notion that black people do more of it relative to their numbers in the population. Because even to this day, if we look at almost across every offense except homicide, there are more whites who just do these things. There are more white poor people. I mean, again, I don't want to make us too uncomfortable here, but I do want to emphasize that the idea of proportionality, the idea of saying a small group of people are overrepresented in these pathological indices starts in the 1890s. So the very first statistic that has any national import, that everybody learns, that everybody references, that produces dissertations, that launches people on their careers, is the statistic that in the 1890 US Census, 12% of the general population of black people were overrepresented in the US prison population. as a 30% of the whole. Almost 3 times overrepresentation. Now, by today's standards, it's a relative linear growth. We're about 13, black people about 13% of the population and 38% of the nation's prison population. But oh my gosh, how much history has come and gone. But the fact is that that use of the statistical disproportion rose out of a particular moment and a particular set of questions. Such numbers were not looked for nor articulated in this moment for African Americans. First, you needed to be free and to be subject to the criminal laws of the state. You could not be chattel property and be a criminal. You were subject to plantation justice prior to that. And secondly, the 1890 census is incredibly important because it is the first census that marks, going back to those pro-slavery abolitionist debates about black people's biological fitness for society, it's the first census to mark a population of African Americans who had never been slaves. So if you're born in 1865 at the moment of the end of the Civil War, by 1890 you are 25 years old. It is a demographer's, pardon my language, wet dream. Because it represents a truly unique generational cohort where you could measure by the standards of that day mortality statistics, morbidity rates, meaning disease incidence in the population, and infant mortality. Those were 3 of the most popular ways of measuring the health and wellness of a demographic group. And one individual turned to the prison statistic number and made an entire career of it. His name was Frederick L. Hoffman. He was an actuary at Prudential Insurance for his entire career, located in Newark, New Jersey. He has a fascinating history. I cannot tell you his journey. He was a German immigrant to this country, penniless, but very smart, had a knack for statistics, and literally made a name for himself. But he was the first popularizer of the idea that by seeing that the black population was overrepresented in the general prison population of the country, that it was proof that black people were pathological, were inferior, and were a threat to civil society. Now, as a quiz, a very quick quiz, why would black people be overrepresented in the prison population in 1890? Quickly. Black codes, thank you. We didn't waste any time because I had been in audiences before and they said, well, they were poorly educated, which is exactly the mindset of the moment, which was to say there was something wrong with black people that produced these high rates of crime. Now, we don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. The truth is that, of course, some African Americans committed crimes, as was true of every population group. But the truth is we have no idea with that 30% number how many were real criminals versus how many were victims of the black codes or convict leasing or staring at a white woman. We have no idea. But the truth is, the way that that number circulated at the time, the way that Hoffman used the number, was not to put an asterisk on it. There was no statistical regression. There were no footnotes. It was meant to resolve the debate. It was meant to put an end to the conversation. It's to say, unlike the biological scientists who could not prove by their own standards that black people had littler brains than white people, which they admitted over time that they couldn't prove, unlike the biological sciences, the social sciences emerged as the new frontier to capitalize the racial science debate that had begun in the abolitionist period and picked up steam after freedom, because now you really did have to sort black people into particular positions in society. The stakes were much higher, because when 90% of the population is enslaved, you really don't have to spend a lot of intellectual bandwidth. But when all of those formerly enslaved, those 4 million people, were making claims on freedom, the actual infrastructure of white supremacy in America was built. This is not the first moment, I want to emphasize that. But what we know it to be today was built. IQ tests, bell curves, Charles Burry, intelligence testing. All of those social scientific ideas about the fundamental inability of black people to compete with their white peers emerges in a set of studies that begin in the 1890s. And Hoffman, Frederick Hoffman, was a major player in that. Now, how did he get away with it? Well, I've already suggested that he articulated it in a way that said, I am a positivist. And one of his favorite lines was, the numbers speak for themselves. Have any of you ever used such a refrain to end the debate? I'm not going to argue with you because the numbers speak for themselves. Well, this is exactly what Hoffman used. He, in fact, characterized himself as an Alexis de Tocqueville. I mean, he used his foreign birth as evidence that he had no blood on his hands, that he wasn't trapped by the pro-slavery and abolitionist argument, that he was completely objective and neutral in his assessment of black people. And he offered a very robust assessment of what to make of this crime statistic. I'll get to that in a minute. So by saying the numbers speak for themselves, it erases the political economy of Southern racial criminalization. The black codes, as a shorthand. That's not part of the conversation. So many people hear the number, and guess who many of those people were? Because really this is a story about the urban north. This is about Philadelphia. This is about Chicago. They heard those numbers. They heard this actuary from Newark, New Jersey, at Prudential Insurance say to the nation, these people have a special crime problem. And although you fought on behalf of their freedom, they're not really ready for participating in the rules of the road. What I want you to really take away from this is that there is no moment in American history since the end of slavery where black people weren't defined by their criminality, where their humanity was not studied or measured by crime statistics. That should unsettle us, given how the weight of such claims today about what kinds of resources we should put in the community or not. Highest arrest rates in Philadelphia and Chicago. One of the ways in which Hoffman fortified the argument was by actually emphasizing that when you look statistically at the proportion of arrests versus population, they were even greater in a refrain he used to like to say, the freedom-loving North. So what did it mean in the 1890s that if you looked at the arrest statistics in Philadelphia as compared to Charleston, South Carolina, that they were even greater in Philadelphia? Well, for someone like Hoffman and for many contemporaries, including Quakers in the Philadelphia community, this suggested that black people had taken the license of freedom in the North and perverted it into vice. That without the paternalism of the white South to look over the newly freed, and Booker T. Washington was a broker in this transaction. His job partly was to look after the freedmen, to show them the road, to lift the veil of ignorance. But for those who came north too soon, which was the way in which this is articulated, they fell into lives of crime and criminality. This really drove, as many people here know, many of the late 19th century old families of Philadelphia absolutely crazy. And actually, by the time we get to the 1920s, many of them, like Sadie Mossel, who was the first to write a Ph.D. in economics, to get a Ph.D. in economics at the University of Pennsylvania, black woman, Ray Alexander Pace with her husband. They were a famous civil rights couple in Philadelphia. She went on to be a judge, or he went on to be a judge. Someone correct me. She was, yes. Well, she writes this amazing dissertation, and she actually looks back on the earlier days and says Philadelphia was a racial nirvana. It was a utopia until the migrants came. Well, part of what this work argues is that she herself was caught by the compelling case that had been made by these statistics that black people had a special propensity to criminality, and it was predicated on this idea that if the arrest rates were higher in the North, it must be something wrong with them, not Southerners. Just a little statistics 101 note. When you have, for example, this is a theoretical mathematical example, 100% of the population of any group, say all whites, can't have a statistical disproportionality in your prison rates, in your poverty rates. Can't have 101% of the population be incarcerated. Therefore, the smaller the group, if we go to the other extreme, you have 1% of the population, you can have huge disproportion. You can take that 1% and put them all in prison, and that 1% will be over-incarcerated by 100%. You understand the point. It's a theoretical example, but it proves the point that small populations can produce huge disproportions. Therefore, the fact that African Americans have remained roughly 12% of the general population makes them vulnerable to huge disparities in whatever they do, and actually masks the amazing diversity within those groups. A diversity that Du Bois spent a lot of time in this city trying to make plain by pointing out, even before the 20th century, amazingly enough, in a moment where we talk about post-blackness and post-racialness, that guess what? All Negroes were not alike. That there were 4 classes of them by his count. There was an aristocracy, there was a hard working group, there was a working poor, and there was what he called the submerged tenth, which was only about, by his estimate, 6% of the population. Even that was overrepresented in the way that we defined them. But Du Bois's work was almost singularly dismissed as being far too sympathetic to people who did not deserve such sympathy, who had squandered their liberty and freedom. In fact, Roger Lane, and you can look it up for yourself, actually says that Du Bois was complicit in turning a blind eye to the statistical evidence in the 1890s that black people had a special crime problem. And if only Du Bois had faced the truth in that moment, history would have been different. It is fascinating, but again, you don't have to agree with me. Okay, what has this done? Well, it has brainwashed all of us into what historians now call the myth of Southern exceptionalism, which is to say, in our contemporary mind's eye, in today, when we think back to this past, when we think about what does racism really look like in the criminal justice system, because it doesn't look like Michael Nutter is the mayor of Philadelphia and a black, you don't have a current black chief of police anymore, you used to, but you do, okay. Sullivan was the previous one, right?
No, we have a black chief, Ramsey.
Well, but Sullivan was before, right? Wasn't that his name? No, Sylvester. Sylvester, yes, which I thought he was a good guy. So racism doesn't look like that, right? Because you have these black people in charge, and that can't be racist, right? So this idea of the myth of Southern exceptionalism, going back to these earlier days, looked at liberals who were in charge in the North, white liberals, and said, well, you can't have racism in a moment where people like Jane Addams, as the founder of the NAACP, is the leading social worker, and she's trying to help black people. In other words, part of that, our fixation with convict leasing and chain gangs and that Southern story, is that that's where racism in America, that's the stain, the aberration. And so we didn't look to the urban North as the kind of history of our present. And then finally, Native, white, and European immigrant criminals were understood in Hoffman's time as increasingly to be victims of class inequality in American society. So that their criminality was read through an opposite lens as a representation of their victimization in a society that did not distribute work or income or wealth evenly. All right, so those are all the main points. If we stop right now, you have the main points. I want to show you illustratively some examples. I'm running a little late. Can I go 15 more minutes? We'll just go for an hour and then go. You got it? All right, this is fun. All right, so this is an image. This is an image from the Museum of the City of New York. It's from Jacob Riis's book, How the Other Half Lives. And many of you know it's a progressive, standard progressive, muckraking analysis of bad housing that poor people have to live in. In this case, he's actually looking at a bar in downtown New York, and he sees this place as a literal fire trap. But what he's concerned about is not that these are actually sordid men, working class men who might do anything in the still of the night, but that their places of leisure are dangerous places that no one should go. Well, I wanted you to see in this moment what the demographics of the Lower East Side of New York look like in late 19th century, turn of the century New York. You've got one black guy in a room full of white men of various nationalities and backgrounds. And in fact, this is a moment where the whiteness that we attach to European immigrants today was far more uncertain and unstable. So their actual ruddy complexions, in some instances, were read as evidence of their undesirability as newcomers, as Southern and Eastern Europeans to the American project. But Hoffman actually wanted us to see them as the lesser of two evils. So this comparison that I'm making, this history that I'm telling of the experiences of European immigrants alongside African American migrants, when it came to the question of crime, is not one that I made up. It was part of the history itself as it unfolded. So we're going to hear from Hoffman. The first quote to the left is a quote that he says 4 years before he publishes his famous analysis, Race, Traits, and Tendencies of the American Negro, which became a Bible to a set of biological arguments that black people were on the road to racial extinction because of their physical inferiority. But listen to what he says in relation to European immigrants and native-born whites. He's marking here the high rates of criminality and suicide among them. And he says, we must be far from truly civilized as long as we permit to exist or accept as inevitable conditions which year after year drive an increasing army of unfortunates to madness, crime, or suicide. Think about that. Army of unfortunates. Army of unfortunates. He's already characterizing this group of people in spite of their crime. Those are his terms. As people who are victims of a system that is churning bodies in the interest of industrialization, in the interest of wealth creation in this country. And yet when he turns 4 years later to the story of African Americans in Race, Traits, and Tendencies, this is what he says to us. The Irish and the Italians show a percentage of arrests decidedly above the average. If we stop there, if in Fox News culture we just took a sound bite of him to catch him in his aha moment, we'd say, oh, well, he's a nativist, he's a xenophobe, he's using this against these hard-working future Americans. And yet he goes on and say, but yet small when compared to that of the colored element. And I want you to see that quote in relation to the image, because we really are talking. That's what the demographics of New York and Philadelphia look like, which are less than 5% up till the early 20th century. Very small numbers of people, yet beginning to frame big discussions about their future. And then finally, this last quote is the first time we hear from Du Bois, who has been at it now for at least a decade in taking on Hoffman. He actually writes a report in the Annals of the American Political and Social Science Journal, which is published in Philadelphia, called The Study of the Negro Problem in 1897, where he names Hoffman as a kind of nemesis. Hoffman is his Roger Lane, his foil in that moment. But here, he's writing 10 years later when he leaves academia to go to the NAACP, but he points out the double standard, and I wanted you to get it and hear it first, because I want you to know that although Hoffman is the boogeyman in this particular moment, he doesn't get away with it. So Du Bois says, murder may swagger, theft may rule, and prostitution flourish, and let the nation give but spasmodic, intermittent, and lukewarm attention. But let the murderer be black, or the thief brown, and the righteousness of indignation sweeps the world. It is blackness that is condemned and not crime. So what he's seeing is a racial project. He's not seeing and understanding that people who are disadvantaged are in criminogenic situations may produce a certain amount of crime, in spite of the fact that most of them don't. That most, as he noted, were hardworking and who transcended the limitations of their moment. So if we've established that the comparison between European immigrants in the progressive era and African Americans creates two pathways, one that will lead to a set of progressive era responses where crime is read amongst European immigrants as a symptom of their victimization, their class victimization, Hoffman, even at the beginning, helps to set in motion a secondary path, which is to say that black people's criminality is evidence of their inability to transform. And so here he uses crime statistics in relationship along with illegitimacy rates. Don't wonder that we're still talking about today how many black children are born to single women. Now I know this is a touchy area, and we can talk a little bit about it in Q&A, but just make it known that the idea that you could measure a people's worthiness by this becomes statistically a crucial weapon for white supremacists in the progressive era. And it becomes early on not a cause célèbre of let's help rebuild black families that were systematically destroyed in the context of slavery. It becomes a way of saying these people are not worthy of our help until they help themselves. So crime and fatherlessness as two tropes of our contemporary moment were invented statistically in this moment. And so Hoffman says, to understand these crime statistics, I have given the statistics of the general progress of the race in religion and education. Remember all those churches and schools that have been built in the Freedmen's era? For the country at large, and have shown that in church and school the number of members or pupils is constantly increasing, but in the statistics of crime and the data of illegitimacy, the proof is furnished that neither religion nor education has influenced to an appreciable degree the moral progress of the race. So think about that. Plessy, the ink on Plessy versus Ferguson has not yet even been signed, and Hoffman has pronounced us incapable of responding to moral instruction. So our crime is read through a completely different historical, civilizationist lens. These people are fundamentally different, and the crime should be understood as such. Now, Hoffman is positioned here as a progressive, as a northerner, even though some of us don't like to think of him as progressive. He is arguing on behalf of white European immigrants for their inclusion. He's making a space for them to be incorporated. But if we look at what the voice of a Southern governor from Mississippi was in the height of the Jim Crow era, then Mississippi's Governor James K. Vardaman gives us a wonderful illustration of what that voice sounds like using statistics. To school the Negro is to increase his criminality. Official statistics do not lie. And they tell us that the Negroes who can read and write are more criminal than the illiterate. In New England, where they are best educated, they are 4.5 times as criminal as in the Black Belt, where they are most ignorant. The more money for Negro crime, the more money for Negro education, the more Negro crime. This is the unmistakable showing of the United States. So there again, New England, the North, stands in as evidence of racial equality, of liberalism, of a fair chance, and that black people would go and be in those places far away from Mississippi, because essentially the story here is that Mississippi carries the weight of the slavery's past. They're still trying to knock off the stain of racism and white supremacy. And so in this conversation, they see in statistics a weapon to transcend their own racist history. And that's why he's so committed to this notion of official statistics do not lie. Here, ladies and gentlemen, is the justification of black crime statistics to divest in black education at the beginning of the Jim Crow period. Who knew that such statistics carried such weight? Okay, a couple of quick examples. This comes from the Newberry Library, from the Central Howard Association. This is a kind of standard example of a progressive era organization trying to fundraise and fight the ravages of urban poverty and criminality among whites. What I love about this image is that everybody's in it is white. You know, when we think about urban America today, this is not something that, you know, we think about. We have all sorts of words for it: urban, inner city, recently thug. I mean, there's all sorts of ways we talk about these places that black people inhabit without necessarily calling them black spaces. And so this is what the progressive era frontline activism of urban America looked like. Just like that image that Hoffman, that I showed you, Jacob Reese, with the one black eye in the picture. This is presumptively a single woman with so many babies, 5 by my count. 2 are fighting in the middle of the street. Her poverty is evidenced by her dilapidated home with shingles missing. She does a kind of work as a domestic, as a washerwoman that will become almost singularly black, and now today Caribbean or Latin or Latino, as a result of her position in society. She's poor. And to complete this image of poverty, we have an abusive police officer on the street carting away a man. In the background is a saloon, not unlike those liquor board signs that we see plastering black communities across urban America today. So this could be read through our 21st century lenses as a broken home, of poor parenting, of juvenile delinquents in the making. But that's actually not what progressives said of this moment. So they write here, and I don't have this with my notes, and I'm used to seeing things. So long, I can't actually do it. So long as there are bad tenements, sweatshops, brutal policemen, bad jails, child labor, dishonest and grinding employers, saloons and gambling dens, so long as boys are taught to fight and allowed to carry firearms, so long as fathers are indifferent deserters, and mothers must maintain the family by the washboard, so long crime will continue. What will you do to help this association to prevent it? Don't some of those problems sound the same today about gun violence, about fathers who are missing? How is it then that this image disappeared? This notion of a plural face of criminality becomes a singular one. Well, that's the story that I'm trying to tell. Here's the Friends Neighborhood Guild of Philadelphia, an annual report here in 1901, a Quaker organization that was a beachhead against poverty in South Philadelphia. So I ask you the question from this image. So this comes from the, oh, I'm sorry, I meant to put all the archives here so I can be on my best behavior. I think this comes from Swarthmore Library. Yes, we'll just say that for now. I can verify it later. So I ask you, looking at this image, which of those kids is Irish? How about the Italian one? The one who speaks Yiddish? The one who is Polish Catholic? Can you tell? No, you can't tell. You're not meant to know. All you're meant to know is that they're poor. This is what whitening looks like on the ground. This is what taking poverty as a call to intervention and response on our part looks like when annual reports are being written so that you will support the good work that we're doing, just like in the previous slide. So all we know is these kids are poor because why? They don't have any shoes. And yet this same organization, to the right, Friends Neighborhood Guild, from an annual report, captioned, one of our new neighbors. Come on, really? A big piece of watermelon? Now taken in isolation, this might seem innocent enough. Maybe the kid was just really hungry. But it's not innocent enough. Because in another organization, the Pennsylvania Society for Protecting Children from Cruelty, those children were actually dressed and modeled as pickaninnies, which by this time is becoming part of the standard iconography of memorializing the Old South, the nostalgia for the way things used to be. And this is not just a Southern phenomenon, this is a national one. And so we see these images of black people eating big pieces of watermelon in commercial advertising. This is part and parcel of the Jim Crow era, except most of us don't think about it in our own backyards. Maybe this is why I haven't been invited back to Philadelphia. But these are Quakers and liberals. These are good guys and good women doing good work. Yet, they don't want us to see these kids as immigrants. They want us to see them as part of our family. They want us to see them as future Americans. These kids, even though they're helping, they are drawing a hard line around their difference. And so their difference is read as deficiency, as inferiority. And in the same way that these organizations, so the thing about these organizations that I haven't said is that they have probation officers working in these organizations. These are the little kids, but the older kids are going to these places because they've often gotten in trouble with the juvenile court and been assigned to these institutions as an alternative to going away to a corrections facility. So these aren't all great, wonderful kids. They are really because they're kids, but in the way in which we criminalize black youth today. In New York State, for example, if you're 16 years old and you break the law, you are prosecuted as an adult, presumptively. Your childhood is invalidated just by virtue of being 16 years old. So these kids have their childhood intact. These kids, their childhood is on the road to being short-circuited because of the difference. The othering of them puts them on a different path. Well, okay, I'm going to finish with one of the heroes of this story, a guy named James Samuel Stemmons. I found his archive at the Balch Institute. And I don't know if the Balch Institute's lost the archive because of fundraising or because of some big decisions made up top, but I can tell you this. It was a place where it was a researcher's dream because they handed me the whole archive. I could copy anything I wanted for 10 cents, and nobody even looked up from their desk. Right. It was wonderful. so probably a good thing that Stemmons' collection is no longer there, or whatever happened. I'm not passing judgment on them, only to say that when I got a hold of this collection, I had free access, I had full access to it. I encourage anyone who's interested in the story I'm about to tell very quickly about James Stemmons. He's at the Historical Society. There's a wonderfully rich collection of a man who published extensively. He was an early independent political organizer and writer. He came here from Cleveland trying to organize industrial black men, mechanics. He came in 1897 from Cleveland. His first experiment there failed. He wanted to do the same here. He also published a column called The Pilot for many years. He fancied himself a Democrat as a political independent. He corresponded with Booker T. Washington, with Woodrow Wilson, with other key players. He wrote an autobiographical manuscript that, as far as I know, is still unpublished to this day. I'd love to be able to publish it, but I'm at Schamburg, and it's just not easy to do these days, so it's someone else's opportunity. But he was in Philadelphia, a person who took Du Bois's arguments about the double standards that apply to whites and blacks seriously, and tried on the ground in this city to actually take on the crime problem in the spirit of progressivism that was animating all the work of white progressives and liberals on behalf of European immigrants. He tried to do for black people what was happening everywhere else. And what happened? All right, so quickly. This is one example of his organizing work. He establishes an organization called the Association for Equalizing Industrial Opportunities and the League for Civic and Political Reform. It was a joint organization. This is what the dual mission looked like. So the mission was, on the left, to broaden the organization of colored citizens for honest labor at living wages. Sounds a little bit like the new mayor of New York, Bill de Blasio, right? Progressive mayor wants to tax the rich and create opportunities for poor people. We are, by the way, in the greatest period of economic inequality since the Great Depression, if you hadn't read the papers lately. So he's trying to hold the establishment accountable. So this is a pledge that he went to all the white churches that he had influence or connections to. He wanted every parishioner or congregant to sign this pledge to basically treat black mechanics fairly based on their qualifications and their commitment and their ambition, and not to discriminate against them on the basis of their race. So you can see it, I won't read it, but that's what it says in the interest of time. So that's what the pledge. The sphere of influence for this side of his organization was in white churches. The other side of it was, and I'm going to read this handbill. There is no record of the handbill, but I want you to hear his language regarding what to do about the crime problem, because we often think that black people put their head in the sand, that they hide from the truth of their crime, that they're in denial, and we hear everyone from presidents to other kinds of politicians saying we must speak, to this truth, blah, blah, blah. Well, according to both Du Bois and Stemmons, we've been telling that truth for a long time, but it's only worked in one direction. So here he writes a handbill, it's not up there, I'll read it very quickly. To self-respecting colored citizens. The handbill addressed men and women of refined sensibility who were ashamed of the rowdy, ruffianly, blatant, foul-mouthed, corner-lounging, dive-infested elements among them. He wanted to rid the race of this stigma by instructing those who signed the pledge to report every such crime against decency to the League of Civic and Political Reform. This pledge was to show moral support for the organization and to help prosecute and penalize the dissolute and criminal elements among Negroes. He went on to say that the pledge signers promised to hold city officials politically responsible for any dereliction of policing duty. No administration of whatever party would be allowed to ignore the organization's demands for the suppression of any activity manifestly hurtful to the morals or good name of the black community. Translation, this was a robust call for community policing, for black people to police their own communities, to hold the criminal elements accountable in their community. But he didn't articulate it in isolation from a larger economic structure that produced criminality by virtue of hardworking, honest people being turned away from jobs, which is why he has this dual mission, the other part, to suppress corner lounging, public indecency, vicious resorts, and political cronyism among colored citizens. This is dirty laundry on First Street. This is saying we take responsibility for the issues in our community. We're here to do something about it. Well, what happened to James Stemmons's work? He organized a big conference. He got the head of Temple University involved, the head of what was then the National Urban League's Armstrong affiliate. I'm going to shut this down in a minute. Involved. He got a lot of the muckety-mucks in Philadelphia to join into this organization, mostly because they were compelled by his crime arguments. So much so that the mayor of Philadelphia, Rudolph J. Blankenberg, took a meeting with him and high-ranking officials within his committee, a sort of committee that was organizing before the organization really could get off the ground. And that meeting was to discuss both economic isolation and how to deal with crime. Remember, even the progressives were not ignoring the crime problem. They were attaching it to these economic structures, sweatshops, grinding employers. James Stemmons, Philadelphia, a man who spent the rest of his career as a postal worker here, was trying the progressive recipe on behalf of black people. What did Mayor Blankenberg do? Only focus on the crime. And to add insult to injury, not only did he ignore the economic arguments, when the Philadelphia Press, the North American, and the Philadelphia, not the Tribune, the Enquirer, reported on the meeting, as Stemmons himself wrote in a letter to his sister, all they talked about in the paper was our crime. Within the next several months, his idea for community policing became front-page news under the Blankenberg administration when, in 1912, Blankenberg launched a massive anti-vice crusade in the city of Philadelphia to shut down the Tenderloin district here in the city. What was he going after? Who was he going after? He was going after saving the white youth of those communities from the underground economy that plagued them. Left the black community completely untouched. And people wrote about it. Hoffman himself described it as evidence that the mayor had simply stolen his community policing idea. That is not entirely true because the anti-vice crusade spread from New Orleans across the country beginning in 1910. So the idea did not live only in Stemmons' head. But the story, the larger story that came out of that moment was the absolute neglect of the black community's commitment to law and order, to respectability, at the same time that it was fundamentally, under Stemmons' leadership, committed to redressing the economic inequality that plagued the community. The rest of the story is more familiar to you. Philadelphia goes on to have a race riot. In 1918, it is a horrible stain on this city's history. This woman to the left, Adela Bonds, was a worker in the municipal court system here. She was actually a black probation officer, so I've skipped a few years because now we're post-Great Migration. She is ground zero for the Philadelphia race riot when her home is attacked. She lives in a mostly white street. What is described in the press as white thugs show up to her home. They start bricking her place. She fires a warning shot. Some white guy ends up with a bullet in his leg. The police come to the scene. They do not arrest her. They blame it on rough characters in the community and say they had been up to stealing from freight cars in the neighborhood, and that as an officer of the court, she was a threat to them. Now this sounds weird, right? It doesn't quite match what you would expect. Well, what the lieutenant is actually covering up for is a series of attacks on black homeowners that had been going on prior to this moment of Molotov cocktails going into windows. He doesn't want this to be read as evidence of a concerted attempt by white homeowners to keep blacks out of certain communities in Philadelphia. He wants to blame it on white ruffians in the community. But the truth is that that was just the beginning of a powder keg that ripped across South Philadelphia for 5 days of rioting. The Pennsylvania Historical Review has a story, essay written by V.P. Franklin. You can read more about it if you don't know about the Philadelphia race riot of 1918. But in this period from 1917 to 1919, there are dozens and dozens of race riots in the North that are built on the fact that these migrants are threatening the economic privilege of white working classes, many of them first-generation immigrants. To the right is Chicago's race riot in 1919, where 2 white men are stoning to death a black man in the Slaughterhouse District of Chicago. Why does this matter? Because it matters. What Stemmons tried to do in the progressive era is unsuccessful across America. He's not the only one. But as a result of this violence, a new narrative emerges after the Great Migration period, often led by African-American researchers who describe themselves as new Negro researchers, a term that was often attributed to the new Negroes of the Harlem Renaissance. And they begin to tell a very different story of criminality. They begin to tell the story of police violence. They begin to complicate the story of crime statistics and black criminality through the lens of racism in the northern criminal justice system. And here is a perfect example from the Philadelphia Tribune, where you have really usurping and taking back this notion of propriety. We are Philadelphia taxpayers. We have a right to be here, and we are calling on, like Simmons, holding, what did he say, the administration of whatever party accountable for the suppression of hurtful morals, the good name. Now, he was talking about black-on-black crime, which is a term I don't often use, but for the purpose of expediency, I'll say it here. In this instance, it's clear that the police don't do much of either. And here, they're not protecting this black homeowner in this Philadelphia Tribune, which is the Black Weekly's argument. And the note here said they should not have moved into this section. So there's mounting evidence by the 1920s that police officers are absolutely complicit in racial violence directed at innocent black Northerners, which then complicates the very notion of criminality. Because if the police officers are biased, how can we say with any certainty that these arrest statistics actually reflect the behavior of the people that they purport to reflect? In other words, what Hoffman said 20 years before this, that the numbers speak for themselves, is unraveling in the wake of this counter-narrative being led by black journalists and black social scientists and researchers. And here's the last slide, the culminating moment. Coming full circle by 1929, 30 years or 3 decades after Du Bois's 1899 publication of the Philadelphia Negro, we see the face of a black man incarcerated wearing the label Philadelphia Negro behind the bars, not of broken homes, of poor parenting, of pathology, but in fact of ill will, prejudice, segregated schools, Jim Crowism, and our founding father, both of this city, of this nation, of the Library Company of Philadelphia, old man Philadelphia there as Benjamin Franklin, looking back on what has become of his city, the city of brotherly love, in consternation and dismay. And this, to my mind, is the story of our moment. This is the story that helps to explain how we can have mass incarceration, as Michelle Alexander, the cover of her book, has articulated, in an age of color blindness. Because the enduring narrative of black criminality tied to this notion that the numbers prove pathology and broken homes, and as Moynihan would say, the crisis of fatherlessness, and not a structural set of limited choices that black people have. That the structures of inequality that were addressed by progressives on behalf of European immigrants, that was followed up by the New Deal, that was then furthered by a set of benefits that were distributed through the federal government in terms of education and home ownership, known as the GI Bill. Did anyone hear the story on NPR this morning about how rates of college and attendance in higher ed was a direct consequence that Americans never before the 1940s ever imagined that college was actually a universal entitlement, that everyone should go to college. It was precisely because of the GI benefit, a set of benefits that redlined many, if not most, African Americans out of them. All right, we have gone way over, but you guys seem to enjoy it. Thank you so much for your work.